during their career, will statistically 2 in 3 nurses will experience a mental health issue. So this program is one of 3 sessions, and it's going to be led by Rachel Boddy, who is here, who is going to talk about her lived experience. And there will be opportunities at the end in the last 15 minutes to ask any questions that you may have. You can ask them in the chat, or during the session, or ask them at the end. And we will be sending the recording round to everyone after the event, and any kind of resources that we might have as well. So yeah, so that is just about it. I'd like to hand over to Rachel now. Thank you very much for running this for us, Rachel, and over to you. Thanks.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, so my name's Rachel. Just give a quick background history. So the majority of my history is adult nursing. I did most of that in the armed forces. And I specialised in accident emergency, so as an emergency care nurse. I'm now doing return to practice, so I had a little bit of a break for my children, and I'm also doing social psychology degree part-time. My mental health advocacy journey started just over 3 years ago, and that was from my own personal experience with mental illness. Just to add a bit of context of what happened. So over 3 years ago, my sister took her own life. And then I had a lot of other things going on in my life at the time as well. And about a week after that event, I ended up in A&E as a patient this time. So at the time, I didn't really know what was happening to me. Because back then, I didn't know a great deal about mental illness, the different disorders. I hadn't really had a significant experience like that. I just started experiencing things. It was like panic attacks and intrusive thoughts. But at that point, I didn't have words or anything to describe what I was going through. When it first happened, I was trying to do some work to take my mind off things, and it was like that's when the first panic attack happened, and I wasn't sure what it was. I wasn't sure whether it was a physical thing, whether I was dying. So I went to A&E because I was unsure what was happening to me. A few things, like I was getting the pins and needles, sort of massive brain fog, couldn't really think or focus properly, feeling like I couldn't breathe, feeling like someone was squeezing my throat, which was really like scary, bizarre symptom. But those were some of the symptoms that I was experiencing. So I went into A&E, and I was wondering whether it was, mental health related or physical, but I was leaning towards I think this is related to everything that has happened. And I was also kind of aware of the judgments that I was possibly going to face, having been an A&E nurse myself, and being aware of the judgments that I had before I experienced this, and obviously that I was aware that other people had. So when I went into A&E, I wasn't treated kindly, let's say. I couldn't really voice what was happening properly, because there's like an overload of stress. Probably I didn't get a diagnosis of what happened that day, but it was probably a breakdown, something like a nervous breakdown. And I could only sort of describe that I was struggling to breathe. And then I also explained that my sister had just died, to which the nurse sort of puffed and rolled her eyes, did a couple of obs, and then told me to go sit around the corner and wait for the doctor. So that experience is really is like why I'm here talking about this today. I just have to I told that first just to add some context to everything that I'm going to go through around stigma for mental illness, and particularly for nurses, and what I learned through that and what I've learned since. So it's been sort of like over 3 years now, and I've learned a considerable amount since then that I've been able to explain why that happened and what happened to me. But before I go into that, just a quick on stigma, just give a few of the statistics and really quick definition of what stigma is. So we know as part of this program, like 2 in 3 nurses will experience mental illness. And also there's some recent statistics come from RCN Advice Line that 76% rise in staff seeking support for suicidal ideation. So initially, when I started on this journey, it was to advocate for the patients and for people who might be in my place in the with similar situations in the future to get better treatment for them. Obviously, since becoming aware of that more nurses are now also struggling with the mental health, I realised this is something that needs to be there for everyone. It's not just patients. This is for everyone. This is for staff as well, because it's on everyone seems to be struggling. So so it's stigma. Just quick definition of stigma. So it refers to negative beliefs or attitudes towards certain individuals. Obviously, in this case, it's towards people with mental illness. And I'm going to unpick a little bit for some of the misconceptions we have about people with mental illness that I've learned and that I had myself. And there's also different types of stigma. So there's public stigma, which is like societal and cultural. And while I wasn't treated sort of very nice by the nurse looking after me, I didn't want to point finger and blame the nurse necessarily, because I was aware that this is very much a societal stigma. Like this, it's widespread. It wasn't just an individual. And then there's the self-stigma. So that's when the public stigmas become internalized and we internalize them. And that's when we either project that onto other people, so patients, we project them stigmas on and treat them differently. And also then if we have the experience of mental illness ourselves, then we can self-stigmatize, and that can lead to not seeking help, like feelings of shame, thoughts like, oh, I shouldn't be feeling this way, there's something wrong with me. All things that are not going to help you, when you need help, if you are suffering with like a mental illness. So that's why it's like really important to unpick these stigmas and have like an open dialogue about them, because my aim for this was so that people would seek help more. Because when I was looking for the reasons for why people didn't seek help, because my sister didn't seek help, nobody knew she was struggling. She didn't have any diagnosed mental illnesses. So that's another aspect where I've wanted to know why people don't seek help. And one of the big things that keeps coming out is the stigma. So I'm just going to go through some of the common misconceptions that people have about people with mental illness. The first one, sorry, just need a sec. So the first one is that people with mental illness are dangerous or violent, when the statistics show that actually somebody with a mental illness is more likely to be of a danger to themselves than they are other people. And they're more likely to be victims of violence than they are perpetrators. And that misconception generally comes from films and the media, because the people that the most extreme cases are highlighted in films and in the media, but in real life, that's the more rare cases, whereas the most common mental illnesses are anxiety disorders and depressive disorders, which is what the majority of people struggle with who have a mental illness. The other is another misconception is that mental illness is a weakness, or that people can just snap out of it, or it's all in the head, which also isn't true. So mental illnesses are mostly genetic, biological. So if you think particularly for women, that the hormone systems that are involved, things that can happen postnatally, during pregnancy, menopause as well. And then there's environmental factors, all things that are sort of beyond a person's control. And they're the main, generally like the main causes. And then also in the environmental factors, that's where you can factor in trauma. So like trauma is also, can be a major cause of mental illness. And that's where you sort of PTSD, panic disorders, anxiety disorders come in. And in terms of control as well, when I had all the thoughts running through my head before I had any knowledge on this, that that there's something wrong with me, I must be weak, this hasn't happened to anyone else. Obviously, when I started to do the studying, when I started studying psychology, I started to understand how the brain works more. I started to understand more about flight, fight, fawn, or freeze, which is essentially my body was going into like a flight or fight all the time. And it was really easy if I managed to relax and calm down, there was a tiny thing could set it off again. And this was happening sort of almost daily. So I know that that's an automatic response. That's not something I chose, because another misconception and what I had in my head, and I don't know where this came from, is that somehow like that mental illness is a choice. And so when I went through the experience myself, I realized it's absolutely not a choice. That's how I started to question it, because I knew that everything that I was experiencing, like I would never choose. Like I wanted this to stop, and there's no way that I would choose this. Another misconception is that mental illnesses aren't real illnesses. So there is quite a lot on trying to make physical health and mental health on equal ground. But I don't know if that's because I've gone looking for it, because I still obviously hear a lot of these misconceptions for people who aren't really looking in this area. So, but the misconception is that mental health is less legitimate than physical health. But I think we are becoming more aware that that's not true. That this should be seen on equal footing, because physical health, if you have poor physical health, that will affect mental health, and if you have poor mental health, that will also affect your physical health through stress, addictions, etc. So and I think one of the ways around this is changing, having this open dialogue like we are now, and like reducing the shame around like mental illness. So like talking openly about it, talking about it as if we would physical illness. Because I notice sort of like when people do talk about it, they say, oh, my mental health. But we don't say, if we have a physical illness, we don't say, oh, it's my physical health. We'll say, oh, it's a stroke, angina. Most people will know the name of the condition. And this is one of the issues that I found that, and I think this is not people's fault. This is purely due to the lack of education of just not knowing the different conditions and not knowing, not having the right words to describe it. So when I I didn't get help in A&E that day, but then I did seek further help through counselling, and was referred for therapy after that. I still didn't really have the words to describe what was happening to me. There were like symptoms that were in line with post-traumatic stress, but I didn't, and I was aware of that with my army background, but I only attributed that to war. I didn't think that could happen from anything else. So yeah, it wasn't until later on that I discovered the words like intrusive thoughts, hypervigilance. The hypervigilance was a big thing, and then learning that the panic attacks and the anxiety attacks were all linked to like a trauma response. Essentially, that my brain hadn't processed the event properly, to being in the past. It was thinking that I was still there. Because obviously I was there on the day and I was the one that called the police. So my brain hadn't processed that properly. And again, that wasn't anything that was in my control. Couple more misconceptions. So another one is that only certain groups of people can get mental illness. Like generally, we think people who are homeless, unemployed. But again, it can happen to anyone. Like I'm an example of that, and my sister's an example of that. So I had a good career in the armed forces. I'm a nurse. We know that 2 in 3 nurses experience mental illness. My sister, she worked for the National Crime Agency. She had a master's in psychology. She'd just bought a new house that she was renovating. And there was no signs of anything. So it really is like a misconception that it only happens to certain groups of people, because it doesn't. And then another is that people, moving on to more like the recovery side, is that people who have mental illness can't hold normal lives. And I think this is part of what contributes to people not wanting to seek help, because I know for myself, I was scared about going down a certain avenue where I was thinking worst case scenario, that I didn't want to end up in being admitted or not being able to work. I just didn't really want to go down that avenue. And so that was kind of preventing me from getting the maximum amount of help sometimes, because I was scared of that happening. But again, that's all part of the stigma for how we used to treat people with mental illness, and the history of it. But the facts are, like, a lot of people, you can go on to live normal lives again with appropriate treatment and support. So I've had quite a lot of treatment and support. I went through CBT. When I went to CBT, I initially went with anxiety, and it wasn't until I went into a bit more detail about some of the things that was happening, and how I was feeling, that they did some trauma assessments. So then I was referred for more intensive CBT. And then I did pay for a private trauma therapist, because once I knew what the issue was, I was on the waiting list with the IAT, because I was really struggling at one point with experiencing that every day. once I knew something that might help it, I looked for a private therapist so that I could have EMDR. And that was, to me, that was a lifesaver. I had, I think, 1 2 hour session, which included a little bit of hypnotherapy as well. And that stopped my panic attacks completely. So for me, that was like magic. I continued with the intensive CBT because I was still had anxiety, like major anxiety. I still had feelings of hypervigilance and panic, but the EMDR stops that from progressing into a full-blown panic attack, which I was so grateful for. And then like the recovery process has been, it's been long, but it's getting, like episodes that have getting longer are getting shorter, and the good times are getting longer. Does that make sense? Just check I said that right. So initially it might have been I'd got a few days break, and then I'd go back to them sort of feelings again. Something would trigger it and it would start again. But because I was learning different modalities, things to cope with it from the therapist, things like breathing techniques, mindfulness, I was working on like my core beliefs as well. Knowing I could use different things, and also recognizing that, oh, this has happened before and I've been able to get myself out of it, helped me to then think, okay, I can get myself out of this episode again. And so that's what I did, and I stuck at that consistently. And then as time has gone on, things have just got better and better. So it's like, it's not that there's a definite, it's not that there's going to be an overnight cure. You're going to take something, it's going to stop. But I can definitely see a progress and how things have improved. Just with even with me talking about it now, this is a huge improvement, because 2 years ago there's absolutely no way I would have spoke about this to anyone, or definitely not on a webinar. So this is like huge progress, because I'd either have had a massive panic attack, or I'd have got too upset to be able to speak about it. And that sort of ties in with the other misconception of mental illness being permanent. So there was the old thinking that the brain is fixed. But now we've become aware of like neuroplasticity. So that just means the brain is more moldable than we thought. Like, it can change. And that's just another message to say, it doesn't have to be, a disorder doesn't have to be permanent, and you can learn to manage it with appropriate treatment and management, and that's what I've done. So moving on to the next part then was just to mention how the stigmatizing, like, as a nurse, and like the nursing cultures, and I think how it appears in nursing culture, and what I experienced that day was like, it was like an attitude of contempt, and that comes from, I tried to work out where that attitude of contempt is, that idea that someone shouldn't be there, or they're in the wrong place, or a feeling that they're doing it to themselves. And I have heard these things said, and I fought them with myself, like when I worked in it, like, what, they shouldn't be here, this is for emergencies only. But I've said that I understand a lot more about it now, and where once you unpick those misconceptions and those stigmas, it helps you to change from having contempt to compassion for people with mental illness. And then another one of the attitudes that I find, I say culturally, but in nursing as well, is attitudes around strength and resilience. Again, this idea of you just need to stick it out. You're just not mentally strong enough, or you just need to soldier on. You can just think your way out of this, without any sort of help or assistance. And again, that they're sort of not always true. So when it comes to strength and resilience, in particular in relation to stress, burnout, post-traumatic stress disorders, even anxiety disorders, you think that the body's sort of like overloaded. And in terms of like optimal performance, you do need a certain amount of stress to have your optimal performance. It's called the Yerkes-Dodson curve, and at the top, the peak point, there's an optimal amount of stress for you to perform at your best. Low amounts of stress, and then you're going to have like low performance. High amounts of stress, it curves off, and that is the end where it's like you go into burnout. I think I can quite safely say within the healthcare profession, it's not going to be low stress that is causing the like inactivity. It's going to be the opposite end of high stress, which is causing burnout, like panic disorder, symptom, mental illness. So in that case, when it comes to strength and resilience, it's not that you're not strong and you're not resilient. It's that you just, the body, the human body and mind is only designed to take certain levels of stress. Just like any sort of physical object, if you were to put too much pressure on it, it would break. And we're exactly the same. If you put too much pressure on a human, they'll break. That's I think that's physics. So if you're on the other end of the high stress, then it's not a case of just digging in and doing more and carry on. It's actually, what can I take off? Like, what do I need to take off the load, and what do I need to do less in order to get back to a normal level of stress? And I think it's getting that across, which I know is difficult because it tends to be a cultural thing as well. You hear it a lot. That the people just need to like work harder or try harder when that's not the case if you're overloaded. And then the other thing with nursing, I find there's an internalized pressure as well that I think can come from the whole idea of like patient first. There's a lot of internal pressure to appear together and for your patient. The nurses do a lot of, well, not just nurses, healthcare professionals do a lot of emotional labour, which is a form of labour. And when you're giving like that emotional support to other people, it's the idea that you can't give that unless you have it yourself. Like, it's the idea of needing to pour from a full cup, not an empty one. So I know myself, the idea of like patient first, I didn't really hear our patient first and me next. I just heard patient first. So I would, when I was still nursing, before this, I would quite often miss my breaks, not eat properly, not drink properly, not really look after myself, probably tell myself that I should have worked harder or that what I did wasn't good enough. all those kinds of things. So, but then I learned that you can't continually do that. If you do want to put the patient first, then you have to pour into yourself first. It's like they're not two things that are mutually exclusive. They're joined together really. That I can give the best care and be the best nurse if I fill myself up first and I make sure that I'm well taken care of and I've prioritized my needs. So last part. So this is where I did work with the RCN on this, because when I did start to feel better and recover, I did want to do something about it, something more. So I approached the RCN and just said, about my experience and told them what happened. And I didn't have any idea at that time, like how I was going to help. I just know that I wanted to, and I was just kind of volunteering my services, even if it was just talking about what happened and what I learned. I was happy to talk about that. So we did make a page on the RCN website about trauma-informed care, so where you can learn more about that. I'll give a summary of what of my take on trauma-informed care. If you've not heard of it before, I know it can be quite a new term for some people, but it came as the outcome for how we combat this and the stigma, and how we get better treatment for people, like in general, with mental illness, because a lot does stem from trauma. So the trauma-informed care is the idea of like showing compassion over contempt for anyone struggling with a mental illness. And the idea of trauma-informed care is to recognise like the widespread impact of trauma. So worldwide, trauma is said to affect like 50 to 80% of people who will experience a traumatic event, and some of them have maybe like more, like 1 to 3. Of that number, around 10% will get post-traumatic stress disorder. And the idea is to spread an awareness of that, and also to avoid re-traumatization. So in my experience, I kind of called it it's like a triple trauma effect. So there was the initial trauma itself, that was traumatizing. And then there was the symptoms, the things that were going on in my body as a result of that were also traumatizing. So constantly feeling on edge and like you're going to die or something really bad's going to happen, that was traumatizing, and sometimes even overtook the first one, because my body was essentially in survival mode, thinking it's just got to survive, which took over like the grief process. So then I wasn't able to grieve properly or fully, because my body was just constantly saying run and fight, basically. So I wasn't able to go through the grieving process when that was happening, and that was very much the priority, to try and stop this from happening. And then the third sort of trauma effect was then seeking help and being made to feel worse and invalidated, as if like I was a burden to people, which then could then trigger like a bit of like a shame spiral of feeling like I was a burden and like there's something wrong with me. I've looked like, obviously I unpicked all of this with a therapist who helped me to see that, you know, those things weren't true. And the big message that I took out of trauma-informed care, that because there's like several core principles, and if you go on to the government website and on the RCM page, there's a lot of detail, and it'll give you like core principles and everything. But the one thing that I always remember, the most important message from it, I think, is that instead of with trauma-informed care, instead of thinking, when you look at someone who's struggling with a mental illness, instead of thinking what's wrong with them in a kind of a what's wrong with them way, with this awareness, you look at them and you say, or you think, what happened to them. It's more, you're giving more knowledge and context to what might have happened to them before, and that's what can turn that contempt into compassion, because you don't know what happened to them before. So that's the main bit about trauma-informed care. And there will be like a link to the page if you want to read more on there's podcasts, there's a video of me just explaining my experience, which was related more to like what I wanted for patients. But obviously now, like I said, I think this is an important message for everyone, not just for patients, for healthcare professionals as well. And so like with just summarising the strategies that I think for change, so I think as well, if you have this awareness around the common misconceptions and trauma-informed care, then you can either offer that to someone else. It doesn't even have to be a patient. It could be, the other statistic is that 1 in 4 people will experience a mental illness in the general population. And if you think you have, at least 4 people close to you that you love, it could be one of them. And we know that most people don't openly talk about it. So I think it's letting them people know. You won't know who those people are necessarily, but it's letting them know that you understand. And for me, I think it's things like it's changing our language. That's a big thing. Having an open dialogue and changing our language and the way we speak about mental illness and people with mental illness. And for me, I think it's avoiding saying things like calling people snowflakes, and saying that they're weak, and because I think if you say that in passing and then someone close to you hears that and then inside they're struggling, like silently, I think they will log that as, oh, if I need help, I won't go to that person. But I think if you adopt, the trauma-informed care approach that's more compassionate and you're more open and less judgmental, then I think that would help people to, speak more and feel comfortable to speak more about it. And then the other is like promoting support systems. So I don't know if support systems exist in the nurse workplace, so I'm still just going back into that. But I know there are other support systems. So one of the ones that I use is it's called SOBS. It's Survivors of Bereavement by Suicide. I didn't attend that for the first. Took me a couple of years. I couldn't go, and then I went with my brother. So that has been a great help. It was really difficult to first attend. It it's still difficult to sit through. But the benefits of being in a group where everybody knows what you're going through, there's no judgment whatsoever. You can talk about your experience if you want to. You can say nothing if you want to. You can just listen, and it's really open and supportive and non-judgmental, and that has been really helpful. So to me, sorry, having a drink. Yeah, so that's just that's one thing that's helped me to talk about this more, because again, I think without that group and being able to talk about it in a space where I know everybody knows what I'm going through, I don't think I'd be able to talk about this openly now if I hadn't have been to that group. So support groups are beneficial, and then there's the different types of therapy as well. The ones that I mentioned, obviously I had CBT and EMDR. But I think, you know, that's different things work for different people. So I would always say sort of like, you know, look around and also like have a feel for what you might, you know, you think might work for you as well. And then the other strategy is encouraging, I think, training and education around awareness of mental health. So this is like this is education, having me doing this now. I think listening to and even passing these messages on to other people about what you've learned, I think that helps. There's mental health first aid courses. I've done one, 2-day one, and I believe with certain trusts there are some funding available for people to go do the mental health first aid course. And then there's the learning on trauma informed care that there's the free open up webpage on the RCM page. I know there's some trusts that there's only a small amount, but there's some trusts that have become trauma informed care trusts, so they've made that part of their motto. And I think lastly, just emphasising the importance of self-compassion and peer support. So if you are struggling with it yourself, it's about giving yourself that self-compassion, like letting yourself off the hook, you know, seeking help and support, and not beating yourself up because it's not your fault. I'd say it's generally all the things that I mentioned, that it's out of your control. It's something that's happened to you, and this is a response that's out of your control. And one of the things we learned from the mental health first aid course, the best thing is, if you are looking to support other people as well, is just asking them the basic question of how can I help? Because sometimes you don't want to re-traumatize people and ask them what happened or tell them what you think they should do, because that could create more anxiety and problems. The best thing you can say to someone if you don't know how to help is to just say, how can I help? And let them tell you. And then that shows them as well that you're a person that they could trust, that maybe even if in that moment they don't want help, you could be someone in the future. So yeah, so I think that's bringing it to a close. I did write a poem as well that's on the page. Hello, but if you want to ask any questions or anything about what I've mentioned, then there's a little bit of time left now, I think, for that.
Rachel, it seems like there's a question.
Thank you very much for that.
Sorry, go ahead, Caroline. I can see there's a question in the Q&A.
Oh, is there?
Yes.
Shall I have a look? Oh, it just says, yeah. If anyone has any questions, to ask them in the chat.
No. There's a question from Jimmy.
Yeah, I
Oh
can
my
see
God.
it from Jimmy. He's saying, did you feel that the hypervigilance would go up or down when it is acute? One can't concentrate. Actually, I'm not quite sure. Right. Jimmy, do you mind putting that in the chat and then everyone can see that? So I'm not quite sure on the question there.
When it would go up and down.
Can you see that question? All right, Rachel.
Yeah, it's that I'll wait for him to clarify a bit more, but I'll just maybe explain at the beginning. It did feel more acute. I liken it to like when you get an injury, you know, if I was to break my leg, it would be really acute at the beginning and the pain would be really intense. And I'd have to have treatment and it'd get better, but then walking on it, I might still get a bit of pain and I'd have to rest again. I saw it a little bit like that. It was a lot more intense at the beginning and worse in the first the month, and then it was still bad, but it was less intense as time went on. And I think it was about a year before I had the EMDR, so it was quite bad over that period of the first year. But it wasn't as intense as when I took myself to A&E, because that was an episode that lasted about 2 hours. It was like 2 hours of one panic attack after the another. That's what it felt like. So that was like the most intense period. And it did lessen a bit after that, but then I think that was me like learning ways to switch it off, you know, making sure my out breath is longer than my in breath, really concentrating on doing deep breathing exercises, cold showers, running my wrists under a cold water tap, things like that. And I'd essentially like switch that off, but then it wouldn't take much to switch it on again. Like I've got small children, so they were always being very loud and noisy, so that anything could or having little falls and stuff as well. Even just them having it startled me, and then my body was back into having that reaction again, where I was like, oh, this is happening again. Like my body wasn't returning to like a normal level, which is what happens with, if someone was to jump out and startle you, for people who haven't experienced this, by the way. So if someone's to jump out and startle you, like, oh God, you give me a fright, your heart's racing, your pupils dilate, but your body brings you back down to a normal level fairly quickly. With what I was experiencing with post-traumatic stress, your body doesn't bring you back down to that normal level. It just keeps going, basically. So I hope did that explain things a little bit more. Hang on, I'm just checking the questions. The link to trauma-informed care, or where you explain more. Yes, so it's on the RCN, the Royal College of Nursing webpage, and I believe anyone can access this, but we will post, I've given the link to post afterwards. And what does EMDR stand for? So it's eye movement desensitization. I'm forgetting what the R stands for now. Can anyone help me out? It's it's a form of therapy, and you can do it in different ways. So you can either do it with sound, so where they pop earphones on and they'll alternate sounds from like the left to right ear, or they use vision. And again, it's getting you to either trace an object that goes from like left to right while you're sort of like accessing the memory. So I didn't have to speak about it, I just had to think about it, and then he used like a visual. And I don't know how it works, I just know it does, but somehow that helped me to put that memory in the past, in the right part of my brain to start processing it, rather than my brain thinking this is happening now, so we need to panic. Does that help explain that a little bit more?
Rachel, there's a question in the chat from Leslie saying
Another
how
one.
long, yeah,
Oh
in the
yeah, that's
chat.
it.
Yeah.
Eye movement, desensitization, and reprocessing. Yeah. Sometimes when I'm put on the spot, I have a little bit of a mind blank. That's all. But yeah.
And someone asks, how long were you away from work? How supportive was your employer?
Oh, so at this point, when this all happened, I wasn't in nursing at that point anyway. So I was having time off my children. So when this happened, I had a toddler and a baby, which yeah, made it a lot harder to deal with. But so I was just running like an Etsy shop online. So I didn't I didn't need any support from an employer at that point. Yeah. Is there another one? Hang on. Sorry, I'm just reading. I've seen another couple of questions. A nurse once told me that nurses eat their own. Do you find nurses less supportive to each other, especially empathizing and understanding what I was going through? Sometimes. Like I said, let's say I have nursing friends and they're all really supportive, understanding. I'm doing my return to nursing practice now, so I'm going back into that sort of employment role. So it'll be interesting to see if nurses are becoming more supportive of each other. I know the RCN is releasing guidance that is going to make it, I don't know if it's going to make it mandatory for nurse wellbeing to be like a priority to managers, which I see that as like a positive thing, because I think there is still a lot of these misconceptions and stigmas around. But I'll probably know a little bit more like the more I work. Just let me read the next one. Do you think there should be a national rollout of training in A&E as a psychiatric nurse working within homelessness? Trauma awareness is crucial. I do, yeah. So I did, when I approached the RCN, I did initially want there to be, I wanted mental health first aid to be made mandatory within the NHS. And then this programme sort of evolved that we would make this just for A&E nurses. But as it evolved, we were going to do a webinar just for A&E nurses. But then as it evolved, it became a web page so that anybody could access it. I think it maybe just needs advertising a little bit more, because the information is on there for people to learn. But then I do think, unless people have had a personal experience themselves, I don't think they'll actively go looking for it. So I do think it's important to make some form of training mandatory. I think it could be included. I think it could be quite easily included on the mandatory training. I've done all the training recently for the return to practice, and there has been a mental health awareness aspect of that. So I think it could be quite easy to just tag on a little bit about trauma-informed care as well. So I do think that, yeah. Another one. How did you go about explaining what you were feeling, experiencing? It seems very difficult to do without the terminology to use to express to someone else. Who did you find was best placed to recognise and hear what was going on and not being dismissive? So I was trying. I had to do a lot of the work myself. I was doing a lot of reading. I found, like I said, I was referred for normal CBT, but I did the the anxiety and depression score, and it was like scoring high for anxiety. And obviously when I first spoke to them, a lot of the thoughts I was getting were really scary, and at that point I definitely wouldn't have told them what they were. So I didn't say anything about those at first. I just said I was experiencing like high amounts of anxiety and the panic attacks. And it wasn't really until they were trying to get me to do some techniques. So like they wanted me to write a worry list, like set aside time in the day to write down what I was worrying about. And that's when I was like, oh, absolutely not. Like there is not a chance in hell I'm going to write down the things that I am worrying about. It's not going to happen. And then I opened up a little bit more, and she was like, well, what are some of the things that you're worrying about, and what are some of the thoughts that you're getting? Because like one of them was every time I was cleaning up, I was sort of getting not like a flashback, but it was from when I was clearing my sister's house, and it was me, these then in like intrusive thoughts of me, and then imagining someone clearing my house, or what if this happened to someone else, and triggering them feelings again. So that's when she realized, oh, I think this is trauma. And then that opened up a new route for me to go, oh, like, because I didn't think that's what it was, and I started learning more about it. And it, like healthcare professional wise, that they were, once I knew what the issue was, I didn't find them dismissive. I found once I went down the right route, people were very helpful. Does that answer everything?
I think there's a question about working in at GPs and nurses feeling isolated and unsupported.
Yeah, working in GP, this is vital for us, but yeah, so I don't know if there could be some additional training in there. Like I said, I would recommend like mental health first aid course. I think there's a 2-day one, but they do like short courses as well, and the learning more about the trauma-informed care, or even if because there's no regulation for who teaches trauma-informed care, I don't think. Even just sharing the message with other people. So there's just one more. Let me see. Thank you for sharing it to help raise awareness. It's great to hear you benefit from therapy and managing symptoms and considering returning to practice. Your lived experience and awareness raising of trauma-informed care is crucial to a culture of compassion towards others experiencing mental health issues. Oh, thank you. And did you find studying psychology? Yeah, studying psychology helped you. I've always had an interest in it, but I went adult nursing, the adult nursing route. But I have always had like a side interest in this. So when this happened, it just propelled that desire even more to learn more about it. I'm 2 years in now. I've still got 2 years left because I'm only doing it part-time, just in the evenings, but massively. I had a couple of moments where there was one where I found where I learned about the window of tolerance, which explained a lot of what happened to me at that point. So where everyone has a window of tolerance and everyone's is different, and different depending on your prior experience, depends on whether you get pushed out of that or stay in it. So if you've had previous trauma, or people who've even had like childhood trauma, then that could make their window of tolerance smaller. So then if two people experience the same event, so if we were to take like the pandemic, for example, but you see two people having a very different experience of it, and one person appearing to cope and one not, we can have judgments on that as well. and think, oh, well, they cope, but I coped, but why aren't they? You don't know what, again, with trauma-informed care, you don't know what's happened to them before. They might have a smaller window of tolerance that makes them less likely to cope. But again, that's things that could have happened to them that were out of their control. So that's one of the big things that I learned, and that I found like really helpful as well. Just let me see, I've seen a couple of more. Having undertaken mental health first aid training, it's fantastic. Highly recommend to all. Downside is not a transferable across roles, as I'm told the support for me as an advocate would not cross over into other organisations. I feel this is a shame, and maybe improvements could be made in this training from that aspect. Yeah, I agree. I mean, personally, I would love there to be like a standardised mental health first aid, like we have basic life support, and for that to be done exactly the same as everyone has to do basic life support once a year. Everyone has to do like a mental health life support equivalent. I think, especially if we're going to see them on par with each other, I just think it should be the same. I think we should have the same training, and it should be mandatory, just like basic life support is. It's very useful to move into occupational health and talking to individuals who like you experience trauma and mental illness. Thank you for sharing your experience. Thank you. Yeah, no, thank you for all the questions. Oh, I can't, the sounds are,
On behalf of everyone and from Docs in Distress, Rachel, thank you very much for sharing that, your story and all that very useful information. We'll try and get those links from you and share those with everyone afterwards, and we've recorded the session, so
yeah, that's no problem.
Look back on it. So yeah, huge thank you, because I think everyone's really appreciated it.
No, that's great, and thank you for listening to me. So